Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of the Israel Journey webinar program. I'm your host, Rabbi Ari Enkin, coming to you live from Beit Shemesh, Israel, on this wonderful October 14th, 2015. As you may know, this is all new to me. This is my first evening presenting this class to you. You've had Rabbi Ken Spiro until now with his Israel Journey History program. I'll be doing something somewhat similar. I'll be taking us into a journey with the story of the Jewish people in the medieval era, about 750 to 1650. So that's what we're doing now. Now, feel free to ask questions at any time. You can punch in a question in your box if you want to ask one at any time. And again, I'll be happy to take questions in the course of the presentation at any time. So without further ado, let's get started. Going to our next slide now. Okay, as you can see in the slide, our primary text for this course will be Herald of Destiny, the story of the Jews in the medieval era, 750 to 1650, by Rabbi Beryl Wine, a very well-known Jerusalem-based historian, American Jerusalem-based historian, and he has an entire series of history books, and we'll be using his books, again, beginning with this one, Herald of Destiny, for our course. So those who wanted to get their own copy to kind of follow alongside, to kind of review, to really know the material well, are welcome to do so. This book is available. It's a very popular book. It's available in any Jewish bookstore, which can be found in virtually any major Jewish community around the world. So that's what we're doing in this program. Let's go on to our next slide. Okay, so we're going to take you now to Babylon, or Babylonia, or if I can use the Hebrew, Bavel, where Jewish life was centered at this time. The Babylonian Talmud was completed in the 6th century. That's it. Talmud is closed. Now, the rabbis who then took the role of continuing the Torah tradition, those who were the leaders of transmitting Torah and educating the Jewish people in the Torah way, this new world, this new group of rabbis were called the Gaonim. The word Gaonim essentially means geniuses. Could also mean someone who's perfect, very polished, very sharpened. In modern day Israeli Hebrew, we call someone who's a genius, someone who's very smart, we call him a Gaon. Gaon can be spelled G-E-O-N or G-A-O-N. I use both interchangeably. So now we're post-Talmudic era. The Talmud has been completed. The center of Jewish life is essentially Babylonia, due to the exile of the Jewish people. And the rabbinic leaders at that time, again, were called the Gaonim. This is approximately the year 589. The period of the Gaonim continued for about 450 years. And we'll get to it at its right time, in the right place. But after the Gaonim, the rabbis, the world of rabbis that took over the next stage, they were called the Rishonim, the early authorities, which takes us into the modern day era where we are right now, and our rabbis are called the Achronim, the later authorities. Back to Bavel, back to Babylonia, there were two major academies, centers of Jewish scholarship back in Babylon. One was in the city of Sura, and the other was in the city of Pumbedita. And you can see on that map on your screen right now, in the area of Iraq, along the Euphrates River, if I'm not mistaken, that would be the Euphrates. You can see exactly where Pumbedita lay, and where Sura lay. You can see its relationship to the city of Jerusalem and the rest of the Middle East of that time. Okay, of the two academies, the academy in Sura was originally more dominant, more scholarly, produced better rabbis, greater rabbis, but its authority waned towards the end of this Gaonic period, towards the end of the 450-year period, and it was the Pumbedita scholars that then ascended to greatness and to primary leadership. Okay, so there you go. There were other academies in Iraq and Babylon, many, as a matter of fact. The names right now escape me. I didn't prepare them, but there were. I'm embarrassed. Forgot the names, but there were many academies. Probably a dozen different cities in Babylon had great Jewish communities and great Jewish centers of scholarship. But again, Pumbedita and Sura were the greatest. Let's go to the next slide. Now, what did these rabbis of Babylon do? What was their role? Their role was to interpret the Talmud, and by extension interpret the Torah, and by extension all of Jewish law. And it was the rabbis of Babylon, it was the Gaonim, believe it or not of the land of Israel. Not of the land of Israel, but it was the rabbis in Babylon who issued all the major rulings during this era, during this period of time. Any worldwide, world-renowned rulings affecting distant Jewish communities, issues of major importance in Jewish law, this was all decided by the Gaonim of Babylonia. During this period, the Babylonian schools were the chief centers of Jewish learning, and the Gaonim were the heads of these schools. And as you can imagine from what I said just a moment ago, these were the highest authorities of Jewish law in the world. Sadly, and it is sad, I guess, that the scholarship of the land of Israel had diminished tremendously due to the exile, due to the persecution, and when the Jews were exiled to Babylonia, Bavel, so of course the scholarship came with them and was further developed there. Okay? Despite the difficulties which hampered the communication of the period, they did not have email back then. Okay, they did not have fax machines. You may not believe it, but it really is true. There was a period in time there were no fax machines or emails, and yes, not even WhatsApp. I know you probably can't imagine what Jewish life would have been without WhatsApp and SMS and email, but believe it or not, back in Babylon, they did not have it, and therefore they had to rely on all kinds of mail, Pony Express. And as a footnote, the mail system is actually very old. I think it was the Persians that established very well, in fact, a postal system, the first postal system that was the model for everyone else for all time. So despite the difficulties which hampered communications, the Jews who lived in even the most distant countries, and keep in mind that at that time, the Jews basically lived in the Mediterranean basin, from Morocco to Babylon, maybe slightly more eastwards, not too much, but that's where the Jewish community lay. And it was from all these countries that they would send their letters, their inquiries to the great rabbis of Babylon, excuse me, to make the decisions in Jewish law for them. In the latter centuries of the Gaonic period, from the middle of the 10th to the middle of the 11th century, their supremacy lessened. Why? Because the study of Talmud grew. Jewish scholarship grew in other places. And the inhabitants of these regions gradually began to submit their questions to the rabbis where they lived. And eventually, there was the Babylonian scholars, and by extension, Babylon itself, ceased to become the center of Torah law, of rulings, the center of scholarship. Again, it was taken away from Babylon, and that's actually a very good development because Jews became self-sufficient. They became more sharpened in self-study. Rabbis grew into greater and greater scholars due to emphasis on advanced study. And as I mentioned, the Jewish communities were spiritually self-sustaining because they had scholarship. And that, my friends, has always been the key to Jewish survival, scholarship. literacy in Jewish texts. There has never been any alternative to Jewish survival. There's never been any other key to Jewish survival, and that's why the Jews have always been into education. Whether it's secular education or religious education, Jews have some kind of DNA in us, some kind of particle, an atom that encourages us to study. Again, whether it's secular or religious, in my case, I was fortunate to study both at advanced levels in university and the yeshiva, something I encourage everyone to do, not to focus on either one alone, but everyone should have advanced knowledge and education in the secular world, as well as advanced knowledge and education in the religious world, and of course in the Jewish case, I mean the Torah world and Torah scholarship. And that's how Jews survive through education. Let's go on to our next slide. Okay, a bit more about the Gaonim. The title Gaon, as I mentioned at the beginning, the title Gaon came into use at the Babylonian academies of Sura and Pumbedita, though there was still the original title, which exists today, by the way, of Rosh Yeshiva, meaning head of the academy. Today, you go to any yeshiva in the world, the person who runs it is not called the Gaon. He's called the Rosh Yeshiva. He may indeed be a Gaon, a genius, as I mentioned earlier. The word Gaon means genius. The leaders of yeshivot today are generally very, very advanced scholars. They are geniuses. They are Gaonim, but their title is not Gaon. In this case, in our day and age, Gaon is used as an adjective, not as a noun. Whereas back then it was as well a noun. It was the official title of the institution. But again, in Babylon, they had both the Gaon and the Rosh Yeshiva, and the Aramaic term, which is still in use today, was Reish Mitivta, or Rosh Mitivta, and that term is used today, and it's usually a term that's applied to rabbis who teach in a yeshiva, who are not the Rosh Yeshiva. That's generally how Rosh Mitivta is used today, head of the academy. It's a title given to rabbis who teach in the yeshiva who are not the Rosh Yeshiva, while the Rosh Yeshiva, who is deemed the complete head of the yeshiva, is called the Rosh Yeshiva. The title Gaon became popular in use around the end of the 6th century, as the academies of Sura and Pumbedita were invested with judicial authority. The Gaon also officiated as a supreme judge. Now, early in the Gaonic era, the majority of the questions were sent from neighboring lands, I mentioned just a moment ago. Now, here's the key. Here's something neat. There's an entire body of literature that still exists of the questions and answers that were sent back and forth between the Jewish communities around the world and the scholars in Bavel, the scholars in Babylon. This is called responsa literature. This style of writing, this style and body of scholarship continues to this very day, where questions are submitted to the greatest scholars of the generation, and the scholars answer them with these questions and answers, often being put into books called responsa literature. Again, this is modeled after the ancient Babylonian model of Jews sending their questions to the greatest scholars in Babylon. The questions were usually limited to one or more specific cases, while the responsas to these questions would give a ruling. Often there'd be a reason given as well for the ruling, and if you were really lucky, you also received a little bit of a longer response, which included supporting citations, sources, and references from the Talmud and any other works of scholarship that the rabbis had access to, that were around at the time. And if you were really lucky, the rabbis even took a time to refute any possible objections to their ruling. So they would give a ruling, they give the sources for it, and then they would have in this response, they would have something like, and if you think that I'm wrong, the halacha and the ruling should be so and so, don't think like that, because this would be wrong because of X, Y, and Z, and the rabbis would preempt and defend their rulings against any possible objections. Okay, Great. Let's go on to our next slide. I think we've covered all that we need to know about the communication and the authority of scholarship that the scholars of Bavel held. Okay, let's go on to our next slide. The later Gaonim did not restrict themselves to the Mishnah and the Talmud, but what would they do? They would use the decisions and responses of their predecessors as precedent. Okay? These responses of the later Gaonim were often essays on Talmudic themes, and since a single letter often answered many questions, again, these are put into book format, and many responsa literature was created. In fact, we even have the responsa literature from the Gaonim still around today that you can get your hands on. Other books that came from the Gaonim and the Gaonic era is, for example, the Siddur. That's right, the Siddur is the prayer book that Jews use every single day. The Siddur was actually codified or compiled, canonized, whatever word you'd like to use, in Bavel, in Babylon. I keep using the Hebrew word, please excuse me, and I'll continue to do so. And one of the patriarchs, the primary authorities on the Siddur, was a rabbi named Rabbi Amram Gaon. As you can see in the picture on your screen, there's streets named after the Gaonim, and you have a picture of a street sign in Israel, in Tel Aviv, Rehov, the street, Amram Gaon, Amram, the Gaonic rabbi from Babylon. And he wrote what is basically the first siddur and the source for all other siddurs, prayer books, that are in use today. And actually, point of interest, Rabbi Amram Gaon wrote his siddur actually as a response to Jews of Spain that had sent him questions about the laws of prayer. There's also the letter of Rabbi Sharira Gaon, beautiful work available in English, I happen to have as well, which sets out the history of the Mishnah and the Talmud in response to a question received from Tunisia. So that's how Gaonic literature came to be. Questions were sent to the Gaonim, and the Gaonim answered with sometimes tremendous bodies of work, like the letter of Rabbi Sharira Gaon and the siddur of Rabbi Amram Gaon, okay, which again continue to this very day. Let's go on to our next slide. Another very fascinating, interesting point of life in Babylon back then was the Yarchei Kala. Okay, 2 months of every year were known as the Yarchei Kala months. Yarchei Kala means the months of the bride. What was this? Every year in the Hebrew month of Adar, that which corresponds essentially to March, and the month of Elul, which corresponds roughly to August, were used for study. That's right. People would drop everything they were doing and head to the academies of Babylon, as mentioned, Surah, Pumbedita, and others, and they would spend a month immersed in Torah study. And they would come from all over the world to these academies to study during the Yarchei Kala months. In fact, you can see in the picture on your screen, I put for you over there an advertisement for another Yarchei Kala program that takes place in Jerusalem. The Yarchei Kala idea, the Yarchei Kala model continues to this very day. No, people don't generally drop what they're doing for a whole month and study, but whenever great synagogues or yeshivas present an intensive learning session for 2 days, a week, 2 weeks, what have you, they call it the Yarchei Kala learning session in memory of the Yarchei Kala that took place in Bavel, in Babylon. Okay, so again, that's 1 month, twice a year, where many people would come for study. During the first 3 weeks of these Yarchei Kala study programs, the scholar seated in the first row would teach the Talmud, or I should say the section of Talmud that had been assigned for study during the preceding months. You see, the yeshivas, the academies of Bavel, would let the world know which volume of Talmud would be studied in the upcoming Yarchei Kala. And with that, the people around the world were able to prepare for the upcoming Yarchei Kala study session by reviewing the relevant texts. And hence they would go to the Yarchei Kallah sessions to basically get explanation and deeper meaning and understanding in the texts that they were studying. So they must have sent letters around the world. Again, there was no SMS back then. There was no WhatsApp, email, nothing like that. But nevertheless, the academies of Babylon would let the world know, if you're coming to join us in Adar, or if you're coming to join us in Elul, we'll be studying X, Y, and Z. Be sure to prepare in your hometown for the study of X, Y, and Z by getting acquainted with the material before you arrive. At the Yarchei Kallah, it was very much like a university of old, where discussions, a lot of oral debate, a lot of discussions, lectures, difficult passages that people would have come across during the course of their study were explained by the Gaon, who was there to help guide the people in better understanding the text. Okay, those who slacked off were sent home. The Yarchei Kallah was not for fooling around. You were not able to check your email during class. You had to be totally devoted to the study at hand, or again, you weren't welcome to stay. At the end of the Yarchei Kallah, the Gaon, the rabbi, the Rosh Hashiva, he would tell everyone what would be next Yarchei Kallah study, and the people would go home. Those who were there would get advance warning what the study would be in the next Yarchei Kallah, and they'd go home to their hometowns, back to work, back to life, back to their families. But in their free time, they'd be studying the upcoming Yarchei Kallah theme, the text that the upcoming Yarchei Kallah would focus on. Okay, the students who were not given seats were exempt from these tasks, from study. They were free to choose a subject according to their needs, according to their desires. Okay, so there was also the option of studying other things at the Yarchei Kallah, but that was a real minority of attendees. Everyone else, vast majority of attendees, would study the text at hand. A few more points about the Yarchei Kallah study. The Gaon would lay before the assembly a number of questions that had been sent in from all parts of the world, and the attendees of the Yarchei Kallah would discuss these difficult questions and debate these difficult questions, which helped the rabbis of Babylon prepare their answers. Okay, at the end of the Yarchei Kallah, these questions, the answers, were again read to everyone present. It was confirmed, it was reviewed, and this is another method that the responsa, what we call the tshuvot of the Gaonim, were compiled. That's a very nice thing. It's an important point to keep in mind, is that although the Gaonim were geniuses, they knew the entire Torah, the entire Talmud, the entire body of Jewish law, they did not hesitate to seek counsel with the laymen who would come to the Yarchei Kallah. Because listen, everyone has bright ideas, everyone has a good angle, people see things differently, and this exchange helped the Gaonim perfect their halachic rulings, their rulings of Jewish law. Let's go on to our next slide. And we have over here the story. Get ready, ladies and gentlemen, the story of Rav Sadia Gaon. And indeed, in the foreseeable future, in our history classes, Wednesday evening, we are going to also focus on a primary leading figure of the Jewish people during the era at hand. And today we're going to discuss probably the most famous of all the Gaonim, Rav Sadia Gaon, Sadia ben Joseph. He's known by many different names. We'll call him Rav Sadia Gaon or just Sadia during this presentation. Sadia Gaon, as mentioned, was probably the greatest of all the Gaonim of Babylonian Jewry during this Gaonic period. And his life story is a story on its own. It reveals the weaknesses and the dangers that eventually cost Babylonian Jewry its role as a leader, as the authority of the Jewish world. Sadia was born in 882 or 892, a bit of a difference of opinion among scholars when exactly he was born. He was born in Egypt, and he was from a very illustrious family. Sadia was able to trace his lineage right back to Judah of the Bible. That's Judah from the 12 tribes. As a young child, Sadia was sent, a very young child, I don't think he was 10 yet, when he was sent away from home, away from his mommy, his daddy, his family. He was sent to Tiberias in the land of Israel to study Torah under the greatest scholars of the time, because it was clear to everyone that Sadia was headed for greatness, even at 10 years old. And he went to Tiberias and he studied under the famous Aaron ben Asher. Who was Aaron ben Asher? Aaron ben Asher was the primary authority that confirmed and solidified the Torah's text as we know it. You see, let's face it, back then there was difference of opinions on how certain verses of the Torah should look, or how, for example, different words of the Torah should be spelled. And in fact, to this very day, there's some discrepancies between a Torah, for example, from the Yemenite community versus a Torah from the Ashkenazi community in which some words are spelled differently. Well, before Aaron ben Asher, these differences were much more loud, they were much greater, they were more serious because Torah transmission, as you can imagine, was a game of broken telephone. But Rav Aaron ben Asher took all the texts that were around at the time, and he was able to authoritatively solidify, codify, and canonize the Torah's text as we have it today. He remains the authority of Torah text to this very day. And Sadia, having studied under Aaron ben Asher, became an authority not only in Talmud and Jewish law, but also in scripture. And with that, Sadia wrote a dictionary called the Agron. It was the perhaps first dictionary of the Hebrew language. All this was done before Sadia turned 15 years old. At 15 years old, he returned to his family in Egypt, where he was becoming a very respected scholar. Following that, we know, details are always sketchy in that period, but we know that at 20 years old, or about 20 years old, Sadia was found in Aleppo, Syria. Okay. Give me 1 second. I want to pause one item over here. Yeah. Now, we're going to get into a very difficult part, a difficult chapter in Sadia's life regarding his dispute with Rabbi Aaron ben Meir, who lived in the land of Israel. Now, listen to this. Back in the day, we did not have a calendar, and Jewish holidays were therefore decided by looking at the moon. And we'd know when a new Jewish month starts by looking at the moon, and when we knew when a new Jewish month started, we would be able to prepare for the upcoming holidays accordingly. Now, Ben Meir had a whole new idea. He wanted to introduce a whole new idea, which is very technical, mathematical, not my expertise, so I'm not going to go into all the details. But Aaron ben Meir wanted to create a change in the Jewish calendar as a Jewish world had known it, which would have caused Passover to be celebrated 2 days before it would be expected to be celebrated. We're going into the year 922 now, and Aaron ben Meir is telling the Jewish world, around the world, that Passover is to be celebrated 2 days earlier due to some kind of bright idea, new idea that he had in the laws of the calendar, in the laws of establishing the Jewish months. Now, this revelation of Aaron ben Meir was very controversial. It took the Jewish world by a storm, and the opposition was great. And the opposition was led, of course, by our protagonist, Rav Sadia Gaon. Rav Sadia Gaon at that time had found his way to Baghdad, and he objected, along with most of the scholars of that era, he objected to Aaron ben Meir's idea. Aaron ben Meir's idea of changing the calendar and trying to explain, Aaron ben Meir, that is, trying to explain that Passover should be observed 2 days earlier than it would have been observed otherwise. Rav Sadia Gaon took him on, along with the other Babylonian scholars, but Ben Meir would not be moved. He was, I think by some accounts, an arrogant man, had a big ego. He wasn't going to be put down by the rabbis of Babylon when he was living in the land of Israel. He felt that he was living in the land of Israel, and therefore he had more authority. But that being said, Sadia Gaon responded to Ben Meir with such scholarship, with such scholarship, clarity, articulate debate, that he was invited, Sadia was invited to then serve as a Gaon in Babylonia, which was essentially unheard of because Gaonim were home produced. Gaonim were not flown in. They were never brought from the outside. But Sadia Gaon was clearly a tremendous, tremendous scholar by virtue of the response they gave Ben Meir. And again, that is how Sadia found his way to Babylon. To make a long story short about that story, Passover was observed by most of the world as per Sadia's Gaon's instructions, as it would have been observed. Many in Israel observed Passover 2 days earlier. If Sadia wouldn't have slam dunked, if Sadia wouldn't have prepared a grand slam against Ben Meir, the Jewish world would have split irreparably. But Sadia is credited with fixing up that schism, and the next year already, Jews observed Passover on the same day everywhere they were. That was one war that Sadia had to fight. It was the war with Ben Meir. Another war that Sadia had to fight was the war against the Karaites. The Karaites are a group of Jews. I think the right word is to say they're a group of Jews, even though for all intents and purposes they are not considered to be Jewish from the perspective of Jewish law. The Karaites continue to this very day. The Karaites were a breakoff of the Jewish community back in the day that preached exclusion, that preached abandonment of the Talmud. The Karaites decided to observe only the scripture, only the Bible, and they rejected the oral law, the rabbinic law, and that's what their name means. Karaites means scripture. They were the scripturalists. They rejected all other rabbinic law. Now, the founder of these Karaites was a fellow by the name of Anan ben David. He was born about the year 730. And Anan ben David in 760 was rejected by the Gaonim of Babylon for the post of exilarch. The exilarch was the political leader of the Jewish people. Anan ben David wanted the job. He was rejected. Believe it or not, his younger brother got the job. And he wouldn't give up. He was so insulted that he wasn't given the job of exilarch. He bitterly pursued this quarrel. He caused a lot of strife and machloket, fighting within the Jewish community. And eventually, the fighting got so bad that secular authorities got wind of it, were not happy by it, and Anan ben David was arrested for sedition by the Caliph of Baghdad in 767. Now, under questioning by the Caliph, Anan was able to convince him that no, he wasn't part of the Jewish people. He represented a different version of Judaism. And well, that being said, okay, sorry, Anan, you represent a different version of Judaism. He was released. And with that, Anan, with a chip on his shoulder, founded this new religion called the Karaites. Okay? Many call the Karaites another adaptation of the Sadducees who preceded them. Anan wrote a code of Jewish law. He kind of, covered his breakaway into a new religion. He got many thousands of adherents, Jews who left the Jewish people to join the Karaite movement, primarily in Israel and Egypt. He got a lot of disgruntled Jews. He got a lot of Jews who didn't want to observe the rabbinic law, didn't want, quote unquote, the burden of the Talmud. These are the people that joined Anan ben David and his new religion. Back to Sadia Gaon. Sadia Gaon, in his writings and his speeches and his teachings, was able to expose the falsity of the Karaites, showing it's an illogical religion, inconsistent way of life, hypocritical. It just made no sense. And he wrote many works against the Karaites. These works are written in Arabic. They were also translated into Aramaic and Hebrew. And besides serving as a refutation against the Karaites, Sadia's works later became the basis for a Jewish response to Christian debaters who also similarly attempted to distort the words of the Jewish Bible for their own purposes. Okay, after Sadia was finished with them, the Karaites dwindled in their numbers and in their influence and really never posed a threat to the oral law or to normative Judaism. That's true to this very day. The Karaites are very weak, minimal number around the world. Israel has very few Karaites. I mean, they do exist. They have, I think, in Holon or in Ramleh and a bit in Jerusalem. There's a few Karaite pockets, but they're not very observant in their own religion. And you want my opinion? My guess is that they will probably disappear within a generation or two. Okay, what else could I tell you about it? Now, although Sadia was successful in his war against the Karaites and squashing their rebellion, Sadia, as you can tell by his first fight and the second fight, he really never knew any peace. He never knew any peace. He also had a fight with the Exilarch. So after the Karaites, his third major fight was with the Exilarch, who was a fellow by the name of David ben Zakkai. Ben Zakkai, as a leader of the Babylonian Jewry, the political leader, he was extremely protective of his position, and he first engaged in a dispute with the Gaon of Pumbedita, a fellow named Mar Kohen Tzedek. Now, Mar Kohen Tzedek, he felt, was attempting to arrogate too much power to himself. So in 1928, as a counterweight to Mar Kohen Tzedek, this Ben Zakkai appointed Sadia, the non-Babylonian, but a person with an impressive resume. He installed him as the Gaon of Sura, the city Sura in Babylon. Rav Sadia soon outshone the Gaon of Pumbedita, just as Ben Zakkai had anticipated. Yes, Sadia was indeed the greatest scholar of the time, but unexpectedly, Sadia became a threat to Ben Zakkai himself, and relations then between Ben Zakkai and Rav Sadia were strained. Ben Zakkai was one who ruled high-handedly, and on more than one occasion, he would abuse the powers of his office for his personal benefit. In 930, a complicated and fiercely contested debate was brought before the Exilarch, and in order for the decision of the Exilarch to be binding, had to be countersigned by the reigning Gaonim of the time, i.e. Kohen Tzedek and Sadia. But Kohen Tzedek, by now properly chastened, willingly complied with Ben Zakkai's demand to sign. But Sadia felt that the decision was incorrect, so he would not sign. Ben Zakkai's son threatened Rav Sadia personally and insulted him publicly. Rav Sadia's servants and disciples thereupon struck the son of the Exilarch and forcibly removed him from Sadia's house. Everyone took this matter quite personally. The Gaon excommunicated the Exilarch, and the Exilarch deposed the Gaon. It was a very difficult, bitter time for Jewish relations, Jewish communal relations. The Caliph, by the way, sided with the Exilarch, and therefore Sadia was removed from his office, which caused a serious split in Babylonian Jewry. After this third fight, major fight of Sadia's life, Sadia spent 7 long years in exile back in Baghdad, and there in Baghdad, while he was waiting for the dust to settle, he composed some of the greatest literary works in all of Jewish history. In 937, partly in response to this dire straits of the divided Babylonian community, the two protagonists were finally reconciled, and Rav Sadia was reinstated in office. In 940, Ben Zakkai died, and Rav Sadia himself nominated and supported the candidacy of Ben Zakkai's son Judah to succeed his father as the Exilarch. However, Judah's reign lasted only a few months, as he too died in 940. Rav Sadia then took the son Judah into his own home and raised him as a member of his own family. However, Rav Sadia himself was exhausted by physical disabilities, and in 942 Rav Sadia died, and his son Dosa became the Gaon, but not until 1013. Rav Sadia's legacy is tremendous. Rav Sadia wrote and wrote and wrote. Only fragments of his literary output have survived. He translated the Bible into Aramaic and appended to his work a commentary that became very well known and very well used in the Middle Ages. He composed many works on halakha, Jewish law, Hebrew grammar, linguistics, and liturgy. His most famous book is the Book of Beliefs and Opinions. As you can see in your screen over there, I have a picture of it for you, of an English translation of Sadia Gaon's Beliefs and Opinions that was written in Arabic. In 933, was translated into Hebrew by the famous Yehuda ben Tibon. This book of philosophy, the Book of Beliefs and Opinions, serves as a cornerstone for Jewish faith and the rationality of its philosophy of religion. In his introduction of the book, Rav Sadia wrote that the purpose of his book was to save those sunk in the sea of doubt and overwhelmed by the waves of spiritual error. My heart is grieved, wrote Sadia. My heart is grieved when I see the confusion that is so prevalent concerning matters of our religion, that unintelligent belief and ignorant views are current among those who claim to profess Judaism. Okay. The book, by the way, also was used to refute Christianity, Hinduism, of course, Karaitism, and to a lesser extent, Islam. So if you're into this type of philosophy, you will enjoy the emunot, the deot, beliefs and opinions. Rav Sadia's works in philosophy and Bible were widely read and studied not only by Jews, but by Arab scholars as well. Rav Sadia left a legacy of thought that influences mankind to this day. He represented the highest example of spiritual leadership and scholarship that Babylonian Jewry ever had. He was truly the apex of the time, the apex of the greatness of Babylonian Jewry. That, my friends, I guess I can conclude our study of Sadia Gaon's life. And we'll stop here with this installment of Jewish history in the medieval era. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me this evening. If you have any questions, feel free to email me at any time, rabbi.enkin@unitedwithisrael.org. Again, my email address is rabbi.enkin@unitedwithisrael.org. As we say in Israel, shalom ulehitraot. See you next week.